Howdy, y'all. I'm Luke, and this is the first polýMATHY podcast. And the format of the show is not going to be like this, but I wanted to take advantage of this amazing scenery while I still had the chance. I know some really interesting people who are very erudite, who have a lot of really cool things that they study, because what does polýMATHY mean? It means the study of more than one thing, of many things. And I'm going to get them on the show for some future podcasts. So also, the format of this is going to be live stream, as I'm doing right now. So I want to test it out on episode number 1. So if this goes terribly wrong, it doesn't mess up a cool conversation with someone else who will be a guest in a future episode. So I'm standing here in Marana, Arizona. And here we see Mount Lemmon, which is right about there, which is part of the St. Catalina mountains, which are really cool, and filmed some video there as well. So what am I going to talk about today? Well, I'll tell you in a second. But first, I just want to thank all my Patreon supporters who are followers of my stuff on my Scorpio Martianus Latin and Ancient Greek language YouTube channel, as well as the stuff I do here on my polýMATHY channel, which predominantly has been a lot on ancient Greek. Oh, we got a friend from Tempe, Arizona saying hi. Hi to you as well. What I'd like to talk about today is pronunciation of ancient languages, of ancient Greek and of Latin. So, nimirum, no wonder that Luke Ranieri would be talking about that again. And actually, I was just out here making a recording in Latin for the Scorpio Martianus channel, and that recording will come out in, I don't know, days, weeks, whenever I get the chance. And I was talking about a lot of the more superiores, more severe pronunciation assertions that I've made about Latin and Greek, and how that works. And I want to talk about that today. I made a short recording in Latin, kind of a podcast format on my Patreon channel, which and I'm pretty sure I made the recording available to anyone to go listen to if you're interested, and I'll put the link down in the description later. Not available right now, but if you go to my Patreon, which is patreon.com/Luke Ranieri, you can check it out. I got a lot of free stuff there, as well as the stuff that's just for my Patreon supporters. So in it, I talk about so if we are reconstructing an ancient language, then we have to follow precepts. We can't just make it up, right? So what do we do when we write Latin today and speak Latin today? And the same for ancient Greek, because there are thousands and thousands of people who speak Latin, and I'd say about 1/10 of that number speak ancient Greek today, whether Koine, Attic, and so forth. So what's interesting is sort of to wonder, what are we doing when we do that? It's something kind of out of time. For example, if we were able to reconstruct something truly displaced from certainly my world and my civilization, like, I don't know, Sumerian, for example. And my friend and colleague, Stefano Vittori, has studied that as well, and he has some interesting things to say about it. Hopefully I'll get him on the show at some point. But the thing about so if we are able to reconstruct that, then we're going to reconstruct mores and culture. It's almost like, it reminds me of reconstructing a language accurately for a script of an historical movie. And then when you do that, you have the costumes and you have characters and people. So we kind of want to feel like we're like a reenactment of the Battle of Gettysburg, for example, Civil War reenactors, or Roman legionary reenactors, that kind of thing. It's all really, really interesting, and it's about authenticity, right? So that's something that I find really interesting. I'm not sure why, other than it connects us to the past, and maybe you feel that too about these ancient things. A lot of people seem to be moved by historical fiction, drama, documentaries. For example, the Vikings television show on History Channel, which is an historical drama and a historical, it's not anti-historical, but it's definitely it works fast and loose with the history in order to create a coherent narrative that's inspired by real events. And there's a History Buffs YouTube channel as well, which talks about this kind of concept of an historical movie, when you have this reenactment of an event. Say Braveheart, for example, is a movie that the makers of that YouTube channel really pick on, because Braveheart is pretty much everything in it is historically wrong, but it's a great movie. It's very entertaining, and it had a lot of meaning, has had a lot of meaning and symbolism for the Scottish people, for example, and for anyone who feels a connection to that kind of freedom movement, right? So and yet it's a great movie, but we're doing something that in that movie Braveheart that's not, it lacks authenticity when it comes to those things. So when we're reconstructing something that's truly foreign, like say Sumerian or something, and we make that a part of, we're trying to reconstruct pronunciation, say we can do that really accurately. And then it's about, how, if we reconstruct Sumerian, how accurately can we do it? To what century? To what decade? To what group of people? And that might be valuable, for example, if we learn a foreign language today. French is a really good example because the French tend to be reasonably severe about like what is correct French pronunciation. Parisian usually is the standard there, right? If I were to teach French, I would definitely advocate the standard French, right? Salve Melete, our friend Meletu Suavis is remarking my speaking English. It is strange, isn't it? Yeah, well. So what's so impractical though about taking somewhere, okay, I know exactly how Parisians speak, I can fit it within, every phoneme, I can get down to intonation, and it's also possible for me as a foreign speaker with a lot of work, as an L2 speaker, to get good enough at French not to even have an accent anymore, right? So that's a really neat thing that we can do. And we can do that with almost any modern language, well, pretty much, right? But when we do something that's really, really ancient, how accurate can we get? And if we get really accurate with that, in this case, my theory or theoretical Sumerian reconstruction, what value does that then bring? And if I get to the right decade or century or whatever, then I, of course, start to exclude other parts of the language and literature. And I bring all this up because this is the kind of thing that constantly goes through my head, because this is sort of my area of research and hobby is in this field of reconstruction of ancient phonologies and how they change. In fact, I just put on YouTube today on Scorpio Martianus on my other channel my talk I did in New York, in Living Latin New York, that the Paideia Institute was hosting, and about talking basically from 500 BC to 500 AD, how do Greek and Latin pronunciations change. And it's very it's not really superficial, but it's surface level in the sense that it only covers a few of the topics, and very, very quickly. Was speaking with Stefano Vittori on my podcast I do with Jesse Kraft. Normally I had Stefano Vittori on the podcast for 6 episodes, a 6-hour series in Latin. So if you're able to understand spoken Latin, then definitely listen to it. It's youtube.com/Legio, spelled Legio, LegioXIII, or XIII, so 13th Legion. Legio, Roman numeral 13. And he was taking an interesting perspective when it comes to this idea, which has started to change my mind, because I was following examples such as Sidney Allen, who has done the, I'd say, principal, most famous 20th century work on the reconstruction of classical Latin phonology, as well as Horrocks for Greek, and others. Booth is another one. And they all seem to concentrate on the dominant pronunciation of a language. And it's interesting, then once you kind of figure that out, you can see that they're doing something that's, for lack of a better term, political, in the sense that they have a kind of an agenda that they want to say that, oh, well, this pronunciation lasts for a long time. For example, Allen, and for his books Vōcēs and Vōcēs Latine, where he talks about ancient Greek and Latin pronunciations, how the pronunciation of Latin it can, even with the w sound of the consonantal U, we write it with a V, was even valid possibly up to as late as the 6th century AD, which is pretty crazy. Pardon the giant bug that just flew by. One small part about Arizona I won't miss. I am leaving Arizona in a matter of days, which is why I want to take advantage of this beautiful, it's a giant, I don't know, was that 30 feet cactus with owl owl nest holes in it. It's pretty cool. And the mountains. Also, speaking of nature, I just ran into a falconer. Talk about polýMATHY, right? I never met a falconer named by Rochelle, and had this beautiful Harris hawk, about yay big, and a hawk, and it's called omen, nomen, omen, as we say in Latin. The name is the omen, and his name is literally omen, which I think is pretty cool. Falconers, it's right here. It's pretty cool. So that's a nice thing. Anyway, the issue then is when it comes to dominant pronunciation. Well, what does that mean exactly? So if we're talking about English, for example, there's RP, which is comparable to the Parisian standard French pronunciation, right? So if we start to deviate from that, if we use something that's more Quebecois, that's probably going to be highly unaccepted in most the erudite circles for whatever reason. Just as RP English is a received pronunciation, called falsely sometimes by its nickname, the Queen's English pronunciation. That RP, received pronunciation English, is just the standard English, but it's spoken by 2% of, I'm not sure if it's 2% of Englishmen or British people, Brits, or of 2% of all English speakers worldwide. But this point is that it's vanishingly small amount. It's certainly not a dominant pronunciation. It's the standard, however, that most foreigners learn. Interestingly, though, and this is relevant to this idea when we're going back in time, looking at ancient Greek and ancient Latin pronunciation of whatever century, the pronunciation of oh, I lost my thread there. I swore I wouldn't, but I did. Oh well. Okay, so the pronunciation of RP is just used by a small amount of people, but, oh, I remember now. Okay, so so many Europeans, I think this is interesting, from the massive amount of influence of American movies, music, television shows, etc., they hear American English so much. For example, our rhotic pronunciation. We say car with an on it in most parts of the U.S. and Canada as well, by the way. Don't like to leave out the Canadians. While in most parts of England, you'll usually hear a non-rhotic from the Greek letter rho, which is meant to signify this R at the end of a syllable. So they'll say ka instead of car. So that's a dominant thing there. So a lot of Europeans learn something like RP, but then they add that sound. I find that really interesting. They're using it, and they like to do it. I've asked some of them this because they feel like they're otherwise not acknowledging the letter's existence, even though in British English it's quite silent most of the time. So it's correct in RP to ignore it, to say ka. And it's not really to ignore it, but for the sake of simplicity, that's what I'll say now, right? Just to discount its very presence. Why do it? But yet they add it in. So you have this mix of dominant dialects of British and American English mixed in the voices of a lot of continental Europeans, and not surprisingly, too. It's also really funny. I've heard this when I lived in Japan. The Japanese flying to Australia, it's pretty much it's a lot easier to speak. It's easier for the Japanese to go to Australia to pick up English. So then I'm hearing, it's so funny to hear a Japanese person with an kind of Australian accent plus the Japanese accent at the same time, and it's very comical, and it's not something most of us are used to hearing, unless we're Australian, of course, then we might be okay with it. But for my perspective as speaking general American pronunciation English, which is the typical sound of English you hear out of Hollywood and places like that, with a significant familiarity with the sound of British English just from television and music and Beatles and so forth. Then hearing this weird Japanese Australian combination, it's really bizarre, but it's cool. So it's when we're then taking ourselves and trying to access these ancient languages, there's so many things that we're doing in a way that's completely artificial. Now, learning a foreign language is inherently artificial. A lot of people seek naturalness, and for good reason. I don't think it's a bad idea to do that, because if we have native speakers, which for the most part, native speakers are the ones who are composing literature, and that's usually what captures our interest when we get into the ancient languages, right, like Greek and Latin. They're able to, they're composing these things as native speakers, and native speakers have certain abilities and advantages that just aren't possible for a foreigner to necessarily do, or they'll do it maybe a little bit differently, and that can create its own kind of art. I think of Regina Spektor, the Russian-born singer, who I think she's still in New York, but anyway, she was a pretty popular 10 or so years ago, writing lots of cool songs. So her form of poetry that she puts into the songs that she writes has a unique perspective that's informed from her Russian language background. Though she's, of course, has a great command of English. I think she was just before she became a teenager is when she started living here and picking up English. So she has native level proficiency, but there's something that she does, things that are fun and creative that you wouldn't normally see in a native speaker. So that kind of creativity is fascinating. It's really cool, and it's something that you can get from a foreign influence. It's something that I think we see a little bit in Apuleius, Apuleius being the 2nd century Latin author. You know, was he Roman? Yeah, he was part of the Roman Empire, but he was an Italian. He was born in North Africa, the modern Libya area, and he spoke I believe it was a Berber or a Punic language first, and then, or maybe both, and then Greek, and then Latin. So Latin was his 3rd or 4th language. So we surmise from accounts of himself and of his characters in his books. And that's interesting because I think I'm really a great admirer of what he's doing in his writing style. Some people are rather critical of anything that happens after the year 130 AD. I love that variety. I think it's really interesting, and it feels almost a little bit more normal in a way, because we, as the modern English language goes from early modern English, late 1500s, mid 1500s, maybe up to the present day. So it's about 400 years, give or take. So Apuleius, looking back about 450 years, gets back to the time of Plautus, and Terence and so forth. So he samples all these styles and brings them up to the present day. For him, his present day. So we too, in the sitting in this English world, we look back so there's standard English of today, but English, of course, continues to change and transform with influence from other languages, and just because language will tend to have its own changes in evolution for whatever cause, whatever reason, through the ages. So like I was talking about the artificialness, the seeming artificialness of going back in time, which is always tied to this pronunciation question. If we're reconstructing, let's take the history of Latin letters, the literature itself. We have what we call the classical period. Cicero and Caesar didn't know that they were going to be the gold standard of the Latin language for 2,070 plus years after they were in their heyday. They didn't know that was going to happen. They were just in the moment and composing, right? But after that, authors tend to repeat the styles of Cicero and Caesar, which allows for the language to be preserved in a literary way. Now, it's not too dissimilar from how we deal with English. The way I'm speaking now, right, isn't the most casual way I would be speaking with a buddy or something. It's maybe a little bit more informed by the vocabulary that's appropriate for this somewhat esoteric topic that I'm discussing, right? Though it's reasonably colloquial. But then if I were to write something, it wouldn't be at all like this. It would be structured more formally, and there's these stylistic things which we feel are proper and natural, but are certainly more accurately cultivated, right? And cultivated over a long period. So we have this higher style of the written language, which continues to go forward. while the pronunciation of the language is changing underneath. And of course, the common people don't have the same kind of erudition as, well, Apuleius, for example, or other people who are writing these kinds of things. So this combination of the higher and lower styles, they're always influencing each other. A true diglossia, I don't think really happens truly in Latin for real until maybe the 800s for sure, because that's where the pronunciation is completely and finally divorced. We have a standard reconstructed Latin pronunciation done by Alcuin under Charlemagne, which I talked about in very briefly in my talk in Living Latin in New York. And that's when you have all the various natural pronunciations utterly separate. Because before that, and even after that, you have people from Italy, Spain, France, Portugal, all saying that they speak Latin. But that's not what we think they mean now. We now say that they're speaking, you know, Italian or Proto-Italian, Spanish, French, and so forth, Languedoc, whatever it is. And yet they still saw it as one continuity of a language. They had a heck of a time understanding each other, for sure. But there was, it was more of because today it seems so distinct. Portuguese, and then Spanish, and Catalan, of course, Sardinian, and as well, Italian, Sicilian, French, all these different things. But it was more just if you could, before the standardization and the nationalization of these places, you know, one standard language that becomes strongly enforced by a state, a national government, as the case was in France, later in Italy, much more recently in Italy, the past 150 years, and Germany and so forth. Then you could see you could walk from one place to another. For example, you could go from, starting in maybe Sicily. You could then go across the isthmus, the strait up to the Calabria, and be able to understand those people. But it would be another language derived from Latin, and it would certainly have a lot of differences. But it would be similar enough that communication is possible. And let's say this is the year 1300 about, and you keep or 800, whatever, sometime in the Middle Ages. And then you could go, the same person could go north. If they got to Napoli, by the time they get to Naples, they're probably not going to understand the person anymore. But from the toe of the boot of Italy going north to Naples, yeah, they can understand Neapolitan. But that person so you have Neapolitan, he can go north up to Rome and probably understand the Romanesco, the language of that city. And they'll be able to communicate and keep on going. By the time it gets to Florence, not so much. The Roman can communicate with the Florentine, not with the Milanese person. So it's this, because what is a language? You know, it's really, a language is a dialect with an army, I believe that's, or a navy, which is some dictum I've heard before. And that's really a big part of it. What we define as a language is, as opposed to being a dialectic variation, these are not strong lines at all. And it's not merely a temptation, it's partially a pedagogical necessity to establish this is what the language is, these are its bounds, and and if you go outside of that, then it's something other. And then that's what this whole Latin grammar, Dante called it grammatica, which is just the nickname for the Latin language, meaning a language other than his vulgaris eloquentia that he was using in his book, for example, De Vulgari Eloquentia, which he writes in a highly medievalish kind of Latin. And that's what he was starting to talk about these distinctions. So all of these, whenever we learn a foreign language, unless we're really forced to, which is not often these days, it's a highly artificial process. The natural aspect of language learning is principally done as in our L1 or language 1 or L1 acquisition. In my case, English. I've learned the languages I'm familiar with, all as a middle, high school, or older, basically equivalent to being an adult. So so if this is an artificial process, what are we trying to do exactly? You know, so it's easy with Latin and Greek because we're at least able to use the excuse that I want to read, in the case of Latin, Latin literature. And that's a huge spectrum. You know, it goes from, we have native speakers who are writing stuff from about the 200s BC all the way on to, after the fall of the Roman Empire even. But then it starts to take on these proto-Romance characteristics, which tend to be somewhat disliked a little bit more. It's easy enough just to say, okay, the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the mid-400s. The exact year is escaping me right now. Someone knows it, write it there in the chat there. Thanks. So the whole so we want to be able to maintain this continuity, and the Latin language, the written style, is able to survive. And then by the time we get to the middle of the Middle Ages, through the early Renaissance, when we talk about pronunciation, then we have what we call Italian or now ecclesiastical pronunciation of Latin becomes a standard in Italy, obviously, and it continues to florere. What is that in English? To bloom, to flourish, effectively to this day, especially in for people who either are living in Italy or associated with Italy in some way, or even in the Catholic Church, for example, where it remains the standard pronunciation. People have asked whether or not it should exist at all, because Latin is the language of Cicero, and therefore we need to pronounce like Cicero. And that's the idea, the motivation behind the reconstruction of the classical reconstruction initiatives, which happened in the 1800s. And I believe that Germany was one of the first, or England, and then they were the first ones to really adopt and to get to, not all at once, but to start to introduce this restored classical pronunciation, which has become common to this day. It's interesting for that reason. People from Italy think that that's Germanic pronunciation. It's a German pronunciation, and I've been accused of that, and I find it annoying because I'm, to the best of my ability, trying to sound like an Italian when I speak Latin to some degree, not completely. I'm not trying to sound like a modern Italian using an Italian pronunciation. I'm trying to imitate certain intonational or characteristics that are distinctly not English-like, not Germanic, in the way that I attempt to speak and recite Latin. And why do I even bother doing that? You know, why put so much time and effort into that? And Stefano Vittori, who I mentioned earlier, he calls himself a metricist, which is or metrist, excuse me, just a little bit better sounding, in the sense of being interested in meter and the poetry, in the real, and how that works together. And above all, interestingly, he pointed this out some time ago, that if that the poetry is the best thing. It's the jewel. It's the cherry on top of getting to learn the language. Because if you learn it well enough, then you can really understand the feeling of the poetry through its original sound too. If you get there for something like Latin, and that's it's just endlessly seems so rich to me. It's like the authentic performance of a song. For example, if we hear a cover of a song, say a Beatles song, for example, one of my favorite bands since childhood, hear a cover, it's like, oh, that was good, but it's not Paul McCartney and John Lennon. It doesn't, that authenticity is good. But then if you hear really good covers, you're like, oh wow, that sounds just like George Harrison. It sounds, he's like captured his voice with an imitation. For whatever reason, I find that really, especially if I could hear a live performance, I was like, wow, I feel like I'm there in 1962 or whatever, getting to hear them on stage, Ed Sullivan show kind of thing. And that's pretty cool. I'll get in the sun, get in my eyes. I'll use my handy petasus a little bit there. So that's, I think, why it's interesting. And I guess it's not an argument from reason as much as it's an argument from aesthetic preference. And please leave your comments too below or in the chat here. I'm really interested to hear what you all think about this, because I obviously torture myself thinking about this all the time. Oh, I got that shadow from on the phone. Why don't I show you a little bit of the other mountains we got here in the meantime? So there's some more mountains, more cacti. Yeah, those are cool. That's the sun. More cactus, more mountains. How about that one? That'll probably avoid the because the shadow of the camera on me is probably a lot more gauche than anything. So if it's when we're, because reconstruction of something that's truly, historical, maybe get to a lot of detail of the clothing, if it's cinematic or something, the costumes and the architecture. You're like, oh wow, I will watch this and I feel like I'm there. Or maybe it's a place you can physically go, a space, like maybe it's an amusement park that recreates the ancient Roman Forum or something. I would love to go there if it existed. And you get moved by this authenticity. But it's ultimately, you can use this logic to really get the authentic things scientifically as much as possible. But it's for a non-analytical experience. It's for a non-numerical. You can figure out, you can calculate whatever. It's the reaction is something that's aesthetic, just like music, with all of its precision, complexities, and harmonies, all that structure, like architecture, so forth. It creates this emotional reaction, which is, I think, connects to what's so interesting about being human too, and what we get out of the best parts of our experiences in life. A lot of structure and complexity, which leads to a more spiritual, emotional reward. So and so these things are definitely connected. So all of this is, for me anyway, directly connected to the question of historical pronunciations and dominant pronunciation, right? So if I was interested in the dominant pronunciation of Greek, for example, so ancient Greek, of course, in whatever time period. So take 1st century BC, because that's a regular point of concentration for a lot of people. Man, the bugs here are huge. My God, it's big. What are they called? Fly things. They're just annoying. They don't bite or anything. They look like giant mosquitoes. Mosquito hawks, I think they're called. Whatever. 1st century BC, right? So if we have to choose a standard of Latin, which we seem to have done, not just we today, but through the centuries, Petrarch and also Charlemagne's period, they kept going back to that as, that's, Caesar and Cicero and Virgil. And of course, they're hugely worthy of esteem. Of course, the other tragedy is, it's not just like, they were the best. They happen to be also the ones that were preserved. So it's lucky we have things like Apuleius, which are so unusual, so quirky, so different, that have lasted to the present day. Because, stuff like that was apparently regarded as not important enough, didn't get copied enough, like Caesar's book on grammar, orthography, and pronunciation. It's just like, I don't know if I would kill to get that, but I don't know, I'd kill an animal. I mean, that would be so cool, because he discusses Caesar, for example, his recommended spelling change of words like optumus to optimus and maximus to maximus, and just the issimus, that one to from u to e, and it's called the sonus medius, and it seems to perdurare. What is that in English? I'm speaking Latin today, so I'm forgetting my English. It seems to last through the entire Roman period to some degree, but it definitely seems to be changing. It was changed enough to be more similar to the short letter I, E, as opposed to the short vowel U in Caesar's time, so 1st century BC, so 60s, 50s, 40s BC, to merit commenting on it. We only know this because Quintilian, the grammarian who was preserved 100 years later in the 1st century AD, did talk about that exact thing. Really cool to read these ancient Roman grammarians. I really recommend them. If somebody leaves a comment or reminds me, I can post a list to my to bibliography. Although I do have one on my Latin spreadsheet, which is bit.ly bit.ly/Ranieri Latin pronunciation. And that's a spreadsheet which I show the mutationes, the changes, transformations of Latin pronunciation, and I have a Greek one as well. So if we're in the 1st century BC, you know, Caesar's talking about, oh, this pronunciation change is happening, right? We see Virgil do things like, instead of LLiNYC, quae, which seems to anticipate, like predicare, what is that? Yeah, so it seems to anticipate the change of what is that called? Like, for example, like country names like Germania into something like Germania, a non-syllabic vowel, so nya instead of nya, nya. Maybe not quite a J sound, not quite nya, but close to it, like Italia, instead of, like, the Italian national anthem, Italia, Italia, right, fratelli, Italia, and the lia is one syllable. That's standard now in Italian and other Romance languages, but before, in Latin, you will almost never see it in the poetry. And the poetry is an excellent guide to standard pronunciation, because if we're able to pronounce Latin in a way that works for the poetry, we are able to then feel the poetry like a native speaker, which is the intended audience, at least at first, right? When you have the poetry initially cultivated in the 1st century BC, we have, right, the best, right? Virgil, Ovid, Catullus, Horace, and others. So so we're in the 1st century, and that's the pronunciation that we're after for Latin. And we have a very strong idea of what that's like. And then we see pronunciation changes like the wa to va. We see evidence of that starting to happen in the 1st century AD in Pompeian inscriptions. Of course, the reason we have the Pompeian inscriptions is there happened to be a volcano in 79 AD, which ended up getting all that preserved for us. Bad for them, lucky for us. So it's preserving a lot of weird things, perhaps by chance. You know, there's sampling error. That's a statistical issue, right? So if we have this sampling error, maybe we're oversampling Pompeii. Maybe it's showing a lot of Ascan dialects, or actually it's its own language, influence, accent influence on the Latin language. There's so much that is potentially in the dark. On the other hand, we can say, well, we can ignore these little things as noise, and we can say this is definitely the core of the language, the trunk of it. We can stay within those pronunciation things and not lose heart. And that's the question about dominant pronunciation. But what if we were reconstructing the pronunciation of English today, and everyone was like, oh, well, London, that's got to be the pronunciation of English in the early 21st century, because that's for whatever reason, this period becomes what future scholars look back on who no longer speak English natively, for example, perhaps. And that's 2,000 years from now, right? And they're trying to reconstruct the sounded language, and they've lost video and audio and so forth. If they're in the similar situation to we are when looking back at the ancient Romans and Greeks, so they're able to actually. They're like, okay, we want to do like the RP Londoner sound. They get stuff that maybe like we see that the Queen's English, which is not normal RP, that's something else, which is a little bit more archaic, or it used to be. She's changed her pronunciation over the past several decades. And then they'll be like, oh, but she's doing this. And then you have these conflicts that are going on, while all the time we're trying to figure out, oh, wait, what's the normal dominant pronunciation? Then if you had a huge amount of influence of American pronunciation in inscriptions or something, then you find out, oh, no, English is actually rhotic. English, it should be car, not caw. And that's the pronunciation of English in the early 20th century. And English is probably a good deal more diverse, just geographically, obviously, because of how many places there are and numbers of people who are speaking English natively in the world today. But you can see where this goes, where you get a mix where you leave out the beautiful Scottish and Irish pronunciations of Latin. You leave out Welsh pronunciation, the varieties of the United States and Canadian pronunciations, New Zealand, Canada, and India, which has millions of native speakers as well. And so if you find inscriptions or something in somewhere like I don't know, India, which show a lot of peculiar things which don't match, and then they don't, like, oh, should we ignore that? Well, if we do, then we're ignoring millions of people. Is that the way to go? So we have a limited amount of data, and therefore it becomes something which ends up being, unfortunately, closer to art than science. At least that's my perspective at this point. Raffaele Torrigiano will probably argue against that because he's a linguistic scientist, whereas Stefano Vittori, philologist of more than one language, including Egyptian, he is interested in that metrical aspect and the art of it as well. So, especially when we're trying to scientifically apply things to ultimately comes to be the enjoyment of something artistic. I find that really complicated to try to say, oh, it's this way or that way. So, ultimately I was leaning towards what's the Greek pronunciation in the 1st century AD? So what if we wanted to reconstruct that? And I was out here in this very lovely part of the Sonora Desert talking about this a couple years ago, where I talk about the pronunciation of PH, TH, and CH in Latin, like the word for philosophy, which is philosophia, or the island Chios, or Carta, right? And then what's another one? I don't know, Thessalia, for example. That's Thessalia, Thessaly, or whatever word we want. Theoria. So I opined with a very prescriptive, and I thought very reasonable justification too, that, well, these are just the aspirated consonants, because Greek at the time is not demonstrating a transformation from ki, from ka, we do this in English, by the way. We say ka initially, and we do this in most Germanic languages except Dutch, which is interesting. Like I say can, I don't say can. If I say can, I have an Italian accent, right? And German does this too, you know, ich kann. If I say ich kann, it almost sounds like a G. It sounds wrong to the ear. What's interesting too is the Greeks had even less aspirated consonants than the Romans, unaspirated consonants, and so they even sounded like voice consonants to them. Like you see like gubernator is from gubernetes, or maybe it's gubernetes in that period. And it's spelled with a kappa in Greek, but it's written with a G in Latin. There's a lot of words like that. So is that a Greek dialect thing, a Western Greek Magna Graecia trait, or is that true was the kappa normal pronunciation throughout Greece, and then was just changed later? Speaking of things changed later, the word spada in Italian, for example, is from the Greek spatha or spatha with a th, right, with a theta. And that's a great example of how the aspirates that were taken through into Old Latin and Republican Latin, at least, they remained, they remained in that as occlusives or plosives or stops. They didn't become a fricative, because if they become a fricative, then it would have been rendered as an S or something like spassa or something, spassa in Italian, but it's spada. So we have the intervocalic T, the H is completely ignored in normal pronunciation, even if they remember to write it. And then spata becomes spada. There's a lot of words in Italian and Spanish which show that transformation. So in Spanish, for example, dico is digo. With a G, of course, G, it became a G, an intervocalic K becomes a G, and that becomes a fricative later in Greek. So that's fun and weird, right? And there's a little plane flying overhead. Lovely outside, beautiful weather. Now, this whole thing with the fricatives is, I find really interesting or fricatives, well, they're aspirates in Greek, because I was certain that you got classical period, we got at least 100 BC to 100 AD, maybe pushed out to 200 AD, definitely all just aspirates. And the Roman doesn't have an ear for that. So they're just going to say, they're going to render ka, ta, pa as ga, ta, pa, normally when speaking. And that's evident from words like ampulla, which is the diminutive of amphora from Greek, right? Was it amporeos? I'm trying to remember what it is, but it's renders ampora in Latin with a PH, but probably normally pronounced ampora. Now, we have grammarians in the 2nd century AD. This is a recent finding for me and really surprised the heck out of me because I didn't see this a lot in the Horrocks and the Allen. They were very much playing down the fricativization of these aspirates. But when I have Roman grammarians who are telling me now, who's reading this, that it's not ampora, it's amphora with an F. Like you spell it with an F. Well, then the pronunciation is definitely either an F sound, like a fa, by a labiodental fricative, or it's a bilabial fricative, like the Japanese for Fuji, Fuji-san, Mount Fuji, which is a bilabial f. Spanish also has a bilabial voice fricative when they have the intervocalic v, like la vena, for example, or la vena, whatever it is. So that's okay. So it really surprised me that it was that soon. Now the 2nd century is still considered for the broad definition of classical Latin to be classical Latin. Sometimes, so let's say 100 BC to 200 AD. That's, I think, I like the breadth, because if you're trying to say that it's something more narrow, oh, after 130 AD, it's not good anymore. Tacitus, Apuleius, no good. And then you have to say, oh no, it's not 100 BC, it's really 70 BC, I guess because that's when Cicero and Caesar got into their prime and were writing stuff. And then before that, it's just Old Latin. You know, a lot of this stuff is relatively arbitrary in a way because there's just so much more continuity in that. You know, where do we throw up the pomerium as, or pomoerium as Stefano Vittori said in the LegioXIII, the 13th Legion podcast episodes, plural, 6 of them, where we discussed that. Like, where do we finally set up the definition for what qualifies as acceptable? Because practically speaking, we have to set up boundaries. We can't just, like I've demonstrated in other places, like my talk in Living Latin New York, if we just is anyone seriously, I find it a curiosity, but is anyone seriously considering pronouncing Latin the way that Augustine probably did, or Jerome? Because then we'd end up with not in principio era verbo. You're spelling verbum, but you're saying verbo. You know, you're doing all. You're saying not saying you have instead of hominum, homino. You know, homino or whatever it is. You know, there's more than one way you could take it that's relevant. That's another problem too, is it probably wouldn't be systematic. Just as English spelling is all over the place, it's sometimes systematic and sometimes not, because alterations happen at different times. You have some attempts at pronunciation and spelling congruence and archaisms and all kinds of weird things. Like a word like debt. You can't reason that. You just have to know that B happens to be silent in that word. So is it uomino, or is it uomno, or uomeno, or, you know, there's different ways you could take it for some Italian living in the 5th century AD, right? So no one seriously considered reconstructing that and speaking that way, probably. Though I think it'd be really cool. It seems to lose practicality. Though I challenge you to tell me if I'm wrong or right. I don't think I am right about that. I think that's an aesthetic choice. So a lot of this, and I think perhaps our nature too, is people who are so interested in Latin and Greek things, which have a lot of seeming precision to them. At least our way to go about studying them involves a lot of precision, which is not necessarily the way languages ought to be learned. But let's say we have that in our heads, and then we're like, okay, well, it must be this certain way. And I have a scientific background, so I like that precision too. Like, okay, so, you know, it should be this way, and it's, you know, and we're investigating stuff, and there's quantifiable things to it. But even if you have a real living language today, as I demonstrated with English, you know, like, oh, well, this is the pronunciation. What is the pronunciation of English? I'd be very happy if it happened to be RP. If we all had to train ourselves, if we wanted to, you know, get anywhere in the world outside of our familiar discourse, something like Italians do, for example, in their, if they want to be news broadcasters or work in voice acting or cinema, they usually work to suppress their accents unless they're playing some regional character, because that's their style, that's what they do. But there isn't just one pronunciation of English that's standard, right? Because at least RP and General American is the two really big ones, and to ignore New Zealand or Australian, Indian, Scottish, Irish, Welsh pronunciations too would not be great, as if they were less relevant somehow. And if they are, why? They're less relevant perhaps because there are not many people there. Well, 2% is the RP pronunciation, so it's all this stuff is. The more I've looked into it, the more I've studied it, the less it seems solid. The more it seems like as dusty as a pile of sand, like I'm standing on here basically. And that's really annoying. It's really annoying because it's so much easier just to say, okay, well, this is the pronunciation, and that's how it is, and which is what I had asserted right here in this lovely part of the desert, saying that okay, but it's not philosophia, it's philosophia in Latin, because ph makes a p sound, not fa, except it does by the 2nd century. And that's still part of the classical Latin canon, and that which is also part of opinion, apparently. It's easy enough to say, okay, well, if it's in the 1st century BC, oh, it's definitely. But what if it's rustic Latin? What if it's, instead of laetus, it's latus, or latum, which sounds like death, like lethal. It sounds like latum. But it sounds like that to me, and maybe to others who were living in Rome, because the Romans were preserving the I, oi, au, while people outside in Latium were already monophthongizing that. We know that the diphthongs persist into the Roman Empire because the difference in the way that those diphthongs get pronounced, their quality. A good example is how caelum becomes cielo in Italian, and we know it was diphthongized because it was written cielo. It's written cielo today, pronounced cielo, standard Italian, but cielo, the ya glide was there, and there's better examples, but that's one that comes to mind. The quality of the I was open e, and that was maintained from an earlier period. Whereas if it had been monophthongized in the 1st century BC for the dominant, this is where the dominant pronunciation becomes really scientifically relevant, for the dominant pronunciation, then you would not have the results in Romance that you do. You for some words though, and one of them is Cesare in Italian. It's not Cesare, but Cesare. It ought to be Cesare, but it's closed Cesare. The closed E pronunciation means that it was a long E vowel, and A vowel had a long duration quite early. 1st century BC, 1st century AD, definitely the classical period. So in other words, like goda in Italian, not goda, but goda from gauda, meaning that a lot of people are monophthongizing it. So when we're reconstructing this too, what does that mean if we're saying whatever pronunciation is normal, like, oh, we should always say gaudex. Oh, wait a minute, but it's definitely godex or goldex for a lot of people. And we have the result. We can see how it becomes in Romance. And therefore, what is it, if we lose the ability to interact with a more vernacular version of the language, if we can't play with it in the same way or that the native speakers of that period did. Cicero is an example where I believe, is speaking to his daughter in the letter. He's saying the word auricola instead of auricola. Your little adorable ear. It's just using some kind of a cute accent, which was probably normally heard all the time, but was, doubtless, less erudite, and it's reflected in his spelling. The social variation in the Latin language by Jan Adams goes into a lot of detail about this. We got all these wonderful clues. Stefano Vittori thinks we have enough to reconstruct the popular, normal, quote-unquote, language. Or why is that normal? Why is it normal just to be like, to talk more like, whatever man to say, him and me went to the store, it's for you and I, or whatever, all these things that are grammatically wrong and maybe pronunciationally non-standard. Grammatically wrong, what does that mean? And that's it's just this sandcastle. It's this shifting, unstable surface on which to build upon. And I find that really disconcerting. It's super annoying because so many other things that are living modern languages, you can get just so much more data on it. And a lot of these things are very, very good guesses. The way that so many people like Stefano Vittori, Raffaele Turrigiano, of course, his recordings, as well, Daniel Pedersen, a lot of people who are reconstructing and working on reconstructing into pronunciations probably are representing the voice, and maybe with incredible accuracy, of someone speaking Latin in that 300-year period. Probably really accurately. But do they represent enough people to be valid? And why is it valid? You know, maybe it's conventional. Maybe it's not that valid at all. Maybe it's like, maybe the w pronunciation that we use, as Stefano Vittori was opining, isn't really accurate. Maybe it should be more with a compressed lip sound and closer to a v sound, even in the 1st century BC. So instead of veritas, it would be veritas. And so that's, you know, verum, vavi, you know, so it's maybe that, you know, we have plenty of evidence in the 1st century to see that probably not, and we can be comfortable to keeping it a w sound, maybe even through the late empire for a minority of speakers. But then it's just a convention. It's conventional. It's convenient. You know, conventions are really just convenient. If we so if we do that, then well then. And we know that we're using just a convention, like we're using the reconstructed phonemes of, you know, consonants and, to a lesser extent, vowels of you know, of classical Latin as we think. We use it for, you know, Middle Imperial pronunciation or Plautus. Maybe that's not right for Plautus. And we're saying optimus instead of optimus or something if we're reading it. If we're saying quae instead of quae or whatever, you know, that was more Old Latin sounding. If we're doing those things. And that's, well, it's just conventional, because that's just how I learned Latin. Well, then, why don't we just stick with the sound of Latin, which is standard in Italy? I'm playing kind of devil's advocate, but this is echoing what Stefano Vittori said. Since the pronunciation of ecclesiastical Latin is just the pronunciation of Latin in Italy today, in Rome, which is how it's expressed by Emilio Springhetti as well, in his wonderful book, Institutione Stili Latini, PDFs on the Vivarium Novum site, really cool book where in Latin he's talking about, well, this is the pronunciation, and this is the pronunciation of Rome, and this is the pronunciation today, so there's nothing more inane, he says, and more useless than trying to reconstruct Cicero's pronunciation or the pronunciation of the time of the 12 tablets. You know, like, why the heck do that when we can just use this convention, which is standard? And that would be true too of when we deal with, when a foreigner, for example, is learning English literature and going back to either Jane Austen or Shakespeare. They're just going to use the English pronunciation that they learned and say it's RP. Well, RP is completely inappropriate for Shakespeare, and yet it's quite conventional. In America, we study Shakespeare as well, and we just use American pronunciation. We don't think about it as something other than that, and why should we? Seriously, you know, and just write an answer if you got one, because this is really, because it's what I really noticed when I made that video here on the polýMATHY channel about in defense of the ecclesiastical pronunciation of Latin. I noticed the unbelievable fury of people. Most people are like, oh, okay, that's a cool idea. Some people were glad that I was supporting what's now been kind of beaten on, which is the ecclesiastical / Italian pronunciation of Latin as something, you know, inferior or other. You know, it's weird. You get Northern Europeans who are like, oh, that's just something of the Catholics or of the Italians, and therefore it's it almost has a kind of nationalistic undertone. Even it's very odd. And then you have this exact same thing of the Italians, not all of them, but this is obviously very general. This are just some observations I had, and it's not at all statistically valid, but these are the observations I saw, where then you have the Italians and some Spaniards who were Catholics. They wrote comments saying that, oh, well, this is the pronunciation that I use in prayers, and that's the only right pronunciation is the pronunciation I learned in school, and that's the only correct and good pronunciation of Latin, and that the so-called classical reconstructed is nothing more than invented by Germans and Germanic peoples, and just kind of this barbarians. It's weird. It's really weird. It threw me, and I was shocked, and I was so glad then that I made that video about it, and it really especially seeing the vehement aggression against the ecclesiastical / Italian pronunciation. It really should just be Italian pronunciation, but that has some confusing things too, so I say both every time just to keep it clear. Because ecclesiastical is only a relevant term from 1910 or so, when the Pope in that time period decided, oh, the Italian is they call it the Romana pronunciation of Latin. Sure, modern Roman, not ancient Roman, but still. Or is it ancient Roman? That's something else that's worth discussing. And Stefano Vittori and I touched on that in LegioXIII, my podcast. So so just that strong, like, oh, ecclesia is just like not just completely wrong, is it wrong to pronounce Shakespeare in a New Zealand accent? Wrong? What does that mean? And this where we have a really good sense of the original pronunciation of Shakespeare. And I've done some videos on this channel in that. Hopefully we'll do some more soon, because it's a lot of fun. And that really awakens a lot of the beauty of the poetry, because there's rhymes and things which otherwise don't make sense unless that pronunciation system is used. And this is also true for the pronunciation of Latin going back to these periods. So it's just so it's confusing. See, it's like, I can talk about this for an hour, and I feel like I'm barely getting started. So, but I'll try to wrap this up a little bit so I don't go too long, because I really appreciate some of you guys watching live and those of you who are watching in the future. The thing that Stefano Vittori is quite dead set on, and I am as well, is that if the Italian / ecclesiastical pronunciation of Latin is used for Latin of any period, the thing that must be maintained is phonemic vowel length, short and long respectively, syllable quantity without. Now, syllable quantity is easy for Italians. They don't really think about it. They take it for granted that tuta and tutta sound completely different to them, but they don't to a native English speaker or German, etc. And yet that's just as important as the phonemic vowel length. They're two halves of the same, was it medaglia? Medaglio in this Italian idiom. There's two halves of the same, two sides of the same coin. So if you do that, if you have an ecclesiastical / Italian pronunciation of Latin that we use for Latin pronunciation, just conventionally of all periods, we retain phonemic vowel length. Stefano Vittori, he says, and I kind of agree with him, at least partially, let's just use that one. Perfect convention, it's fine. Because then, what's the most important part of the poetry? The rhythm. In Latin poetry, and this is true of also of ancient Greek poetry, you get the long and the shorts, you get all of that. And so you just have the modern convention, you apply backwards, but you retain the most important part. The reason being, of course, if you lose that distinction of the phonemic vowel length, and that is exactly the reason why Latin grammar changes so much, and very evidently by the end of the Roman period, and becomes the Proto-Romance languages, because without that phonemic vowel length, the case system breaks apart even more rapidly. It's kind of retained a little bit in Romanian, but barely. It's hardly there at all. And, to a limited degree, io, me, mi, is retained in Italian, but just like English, I, me, and so forth. Those are vestigia, the vestiges, the mere footprints remaining of that case system from our proto-whatever language. So when we're dealing with the Greek pronunciation in the first century BC, right? Because I found that was what I really wanted to be able to do, was speak Greek the way that Cicero or Caesar were hearing it, because there's so much Greek in their referenced or in their letters and other people from the same period. Like that's the version of quae, quae going from about 400 BC to when the Byzantine Greek starts, about 300, 400, 500 AD. Well, that's the one that I wanted to learn that, first century BC quae. And so I found, okay, without a doubt, you got pa, ta, ka. And then Stefano Vittori, God, I love this guy, he made a very strong argument that's won me over, probably just for aesthetic reasons, but and I think it's Catullus 84, I hope I'm getting that poem right, but it's where Catullus is making fun of some guy who had just been off to Greece and was imitating Greek pronunciation. So he was adding aspiration, he was adding a h sound to everything, like saying koronas. At least that's the interpretation, adding this h sound to everything. Now the last joke, I believe it's hionos. It's referring to the Ionian Sea, but because he's adding an extra aspiration which doesn't belong there, it ends up sounding like the word for winter, which the hionos, I think, is with the kionos, so the X, or rather the letter chi, is related to the word for winter, right? So instead of, I hope it's not some stormy seas, I hope it's actually the Ionian seas, like that's the joke. And it only makes sense, because it can't possibly make sense with a simple H, or it doesn't easily make sense if it's a simple H for ha to be the same as ka. Whereas if it's a ha, it's very easy to associate with the ha of English and Latin. Now one of those different, ha is a velar fricative, and it's buccalized, means in the bucca, it's in the mouth. Whereas ha is debuccalized. It's pharyngeal. Stefano or Raphael or whoever, just remind me later, right in the comments somewhere. Help me with that. Wherever the H sound is articulated, but it's not in the mouth. It's more in the throat, where the ha sound is articulated. So that's what really is like, oh man. But there's no other evidence that's of a dominant change of the pronunciation of the chi letter into a ch or something like it until Allen and Horrocks put it like when Armenian changes in the 10th century AD. But is that just a conventional spelling? And then, however, maybe it's a minority of speakers that say hionos, and maybe that's for some other obscure reason funny, because it sounds like some guy who was talking in an accent, and then, but that's an accent that's known to people. Like, oh, he's saying he does not pronounce the H right, some kind of fun accent. Everybody knows, and then it's just like, oh, I instantly get that joke, especially if it's recited or performed in a certain way. It's like, oh, I got it totally. Or maybe, it's. So Stefano then brings up this idea of overlapping pronunciations. Like maybe you have, because some people are starting to say the novel way, the more evolved way, and other people are using the more archaic way, right? And if that's occurring, then you have this overlap. Like some people maybe are saying nuncius, and others are saying nuntius still. And then how okay is it to overlap, to say habere in one sentence instead of to say avere? If I say, this is the verb to have, if I say avere without the H sound, with some kind of bilabial fricative for the letter B, like Italian avere, or aver in Spanish, right? So if I do that, am I doing something that's more colloquial? Or is that just more common? Whereas saying habere is just more standard somehow. It's, and these are questions. And so especially if we get a broad scope, we said Latin is something that's really broad and wide, and we can go back really far and really far forward as well and say that's all Latin. Then we can kind of get away with saying all of these are variations that are acceptable, and that choosing one or the other is a matter of convention. So the other fricatives, like the th of being a ta or tha, there's evidence that the Spartans in the 6th century were saying a tha, because I think in Athenian inscriptions they're rendering what should be a theta as a sigma with a sa. Alan has a bit on that. And then, what's the other one? Fatha, and then, yeah, so all of them, in the Roman, what I'm going to call classical, 100 BC to 200 AD, all have evidence of those fricatives that I used to say, absolutely not during the Roman Empire. Maybe they weren't dominant, but there's evidence that they existed in some speakers. How are they mixed and matched? This is what Raphael brings up. Like, wait, you can't just like throw this together. You can't just say, whoa. You can't just say like it's okay to use a V sound everywhere in Latin or Greek without doing the others. Like the voiced fricatives ra, ra, va, or ba, whatever it is, definitely happened first. But does that mean for all speakers, if they're doing ra, ra, va, that, or va, whatever it is, that happens first historically, and then later it's cha, tha, fa for those fricatives, which were the aspirates ka, ta, pa, or whatever there was in between. You know, like when is that? Like, so okay, so those definitely come first. So am I doing a better 1st century BC Latin if I say rama, velta, and veta or veta, but I'm also maintaining the unvoiced aspirates, the ki, theta, and pi sounds, right? And I'm maintaining all that in that contrast. I absolutely think that's totally relevant. So a conservative pronunciation of Latin, that's 1st century BC, which is how I tend to attempt to speak, or that's what I think I'm doing. And then a quae pronunciation, which I've been using for Greek lately, which is, there's enough evidence to say that 2nd century AD, you get all these features, but maybe they could be even earlier. Like, and that's where you have Randall Booth, who has this great paper, what is it called, on his website, trying to remember, I'll find the link later, where he, in a short page, basically says, this is how we're going to pronounce Greek. And the koinegreek.com, Ben Cantor's great, really wonderful YouTube channel and stuff, resources he does there, and he does the Booth pronunciation, I think, to a T, where ignoring vowel length, syllable quantity, which definitely happens in Greek by the end of the Roman Empire, and Latin for that matter, ignoring all that, geminated consonants, and turning all the diphthongs I into e, oi into u, u is maintained, ao, eo into af, and ev, you know, evolving all these things forward. I used to think it wasn't relevant because it wasn't, you know, dominant, but now I'm just like, so is it okay for us in Greek to say, you know, eugenia, you know, some kind of fricative, but I'm saying eo, not evgenia. Like, which one came first? We have enough evidence for all of them overlapping. So then I think about the Italian speaking English. And in my best terrible accent of Italian, I apologize in advance, speaking an Italian speaking in English who is doing as best they can. They are combining the pronunciation of something more British, and at the same time saying a car, I need more cars or something, you know, I'm just making this up, but those kinds of mixes happen. Is that the best we can do? Is that as close as we can get? And is that okay? We're not going to have any native speakers pissed off by this. But people are also very strong in their beliefs, and I used to be, really strong, like, this is the pronunciation for this period and this time. And it's got to be this way for a broad period. And I'm like, well, you know, man, but there's these indicia, there's these clues of other things that are going on. So it's complicated. And I don't know where to go with it, other than to say, well, I'm just going to land on this convention and say, okay, this is where I go. The convenient thing, which I think is most relevant, and I believe I've chosen this hill to die on in my eternal struggle, sounds like the Korean War, it's hill to die on, for all this, is that syllable quantity and vowel length are just so important to the literature of all of ancient Greek until the late Western Roman Empire. And I don't know anything about Byzantine literature really, so maybe there too. And throughout everything that we accept as Western Roman, you know, literature, certainly within classical, right? So we have, you know, from ignoring everything before 500 BC, from 500 BC all the way till at least 200, 300 AD, we have phonemic vowel length, we have syllable quantity, we have all that, because that's the fundamental structure of the language. So we maybe are getting che and j and some there for ke and ye. We're getting all these v's and t's, and we're getting all these fun pronunciation changing, all these frigatives, all these things are coming in Greek and Latin. But the one constant, which seems to be consistently true, and is absolutely true, is that they continually are based off of the native speaker's inherent understanding of phonemic vowel length. So that is, for me, the one thing that, like, that's gotta be the alpha and the omega. It's gotta be the fundamental core. So you can hang on to that, attempts at reconstructing different, if we can get regional, but certainly diachronically different stuff, and even if it's all mixed and matched, like Erasmian or Ecclesiastic, which are mixing and matching stuff, which doesn't really belong together if it were the natural evolution of the language, but who cares, as long as we at least get that phonemic vowel length, that's and syllable quantity, if it's there, then we get no nego no bilium sedeos to the osus aquorum, cui tamen ipsa faves winco tatile precor, ud locurate cum venite cumque sedere, ne tibi non notus quem facis esset amor. There's a little bit of Ovid, right? And it's just, you feel that rhythm. Oh, it's so cool. And if it's preserved that way, or arma virumque cano Troiae qui primus aboris Italian fato profugus la vignaque venit litora. If we're able to speak Latin in our, because so many of us are interested in speaking and certainly reciting Latin and ancient Greek in a consistent way, if we make that the consistent part, and we by rights should agree that that is the fundament of the fundament, the basis of these languages, if we can agree on that, then all this other stuff, just have fun. Because if we're speaking these languages every day, and we do with people, and we're playing with different pronunciations, we can we're in a way, we're reviving, right, these languages. We're speaking for these people who are long gone, since we're resurrecting them in a way. If we do that, then we're giving these our little modern voices to these great ancient voices, this ancient literature, then that seems to work for me. But what do you think? So, this has been the first episode of the polýMATHY podcast. Thank you so much for those of you who are watching live. It's really cool. For some of you have been here the whole time, which is amazing. Can't believe I'm still here. And future episodes of the polýMATHY podcast, I'm going to get some really cool people that I know who study different things, polyglots, polymaths, you name it. Maybe not, maybe you won't name it. I'll name it. But all kinds of cool discussions that I want to have, because that's what I talked about today, was one of the things that I'm way too nerdily interested in. And these other people I'll bring on they have their own stuff that they're really into, and I want to hear what they have to say. So, but I know they have some really cool things that they're going to talk about with us here. So thanks again for watching. Thank you to my Patreon supporters. I could not do any of this without you. Seriously. So thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. If you're interested in supporting me, patreon.com/Luke Ranieri. Really, thank you so much, and thank you to all of you just for watching, hanging out, and having fun. Have a great time. If you have any questions, ideas, start discussions down in the comments. I'd appreciate it. So, for now, from Arizona, have a good one.